Wow, you're getting straight to it. That's the key question in some ways, yeah. To abide as the self. So, wait a second, let me have some water. Okay, I'm ready now. Right. To abide as a self. Again, if you went to somebody, if you talk to somebody, basically to abide as a self, again, these are technical terms, aren't they, really? What do I mean by technical terms? I mean that if you were having a conversation with somebody who's not into this, not interested in this, they would say, what the what? Abide the self, what does that mean? So these are technical words. So realize that these are technical words, they have a specific meaning. To abide obviously means to stay in something, or it means to dwell as something. Dwell means to live. So to abide in the self means to stay in the self, to be the self, or to live in the self, or to live as the self. It's got a sense that to abide is also, it's a verb. The word abide is a verb, but it's not a very active verb. It implies something that's not moving very much. You're staying in one place, as opposed to running or going somewhere. You're staying where you are. So it's got that sense of staying. And it's got a sense of, when you abide somewhere, you're not doing it just for 5 seconds or half a second. It's got a sense of, it's a long-term thing. It's a longer-term thing you're doing. So all that is hinted and implied by the word abide. So it's something we're meant to rest in. To abide is also to rest. To rest is the self. To stay there for prolonged time. And in the scriptures, it often uses the word prolonged as well. You usually often get the word prolonged. Prolonged meditation on the self. In the Upanishads, they tell us to abide as the self. They also say to meditate upon the self, which is the same thing. Through meditating on the self, you discover what the self is, and then you become that. You're always the self. But this is how it appears. The self also is a technical term. The self means what you are, what you truly are. And here we see a difference between Ramana's teachings and some other teachings. Ramana's teaching is totally in line with the traditional teachings that have been around for centuries. It's the same teaching. But what Ramana does, he breathes new life into the teachings, and he makes the teachings very clear. They're already very clear. In our text, Vivekachudamani, the teachings are very clear. But somehow it gets distorted. And I think this is because most people aren't into reading scriptures. I happen to be somebody who loves to read scriptures. And I've got an eye for detail. I like to read it, and I pick up the detail on it. That's just the personality I am. So when I read a scripture, it's also the training I've had, through the education I've had, etc., etc. A background in science, this kind of thing. You've got to understand science. When you're trained in science, you're trained to critically appraise things. That means when you read something, you have to very carefully understand what it is saying, what it isn't saying, and the potential holes in arguments. That's how we're taught to read things if you're trained scientifically. And that's my background. So even though the teachings like Vivekachudamani, like the Upanishads, are very clear, when you hear people teach Advaita, they often teach things that are not in the scriptures. They drift away from the scriptures. And this distorts the teaching. We can distort the teaching by taking things that are in the teaching and take them away. That's one way we can distort the teaching. Something that's in the teaching might say you do X, Y, and Z. And if you want to distort the teaching, you just say, just do X and Y, and you forget about Z. Yeah, that's one way you can distort the teaching. Another way you can distort the teaching is by adding something that's not there. If the teaching says you do X, Y, and Z, you can say you do X, Y, and Z, and then you do A, B, and C. And then you've distorted the teaching in a different way by adding to it. Teaching is very clear in Vivekananda, but for some reason, people don't, it's because of ignorance. Because the realization isn't genuine. The teaching gets distorted by the ego. And what Rama does, he teaches us what it is to abide as a self. It's a very radical teaching. The reason the teaching is so radical is because ignorance is very deeply rooted in us. And it takes a radical teaching to get rid of ignorance from almost everyone. There might be a few exceptions. The ignorance is the belief in an I, a separate me. It's the belief I'm a separate, limited entity, the body-mind entity. And and that's the only problem there is. When you come down to it, the only problem there is ignorance. This is one problem. I am the body, the belief I am the body-mind, I am limited. What is that limitation I have? It's this. It's that I think the end of me is here and everything else is separate. The solution, just as only one problem, there's only one solution, which is to abide as the self. In the path of Sri Ramana, it explains why this is the only solution. It takes you through why other ways don't work. I always worry that if I say, look, there's only one problem, one solution, that I can come across like being a bit like a cult, you know? You know how cults, they say, my way is the only way, you see? Every other way is wrong, my way is the only way. That's what a cult says. And if you don't follow me, then you're on the wrong path. This kind of says the same thing. This kind of says the same thing. But let me try and see what the difference is. The difference is there's a reason why. There's a logic, there's an understanding behind it. You don't have to use this teaching, but you have to go through the same process. Whether it's through Ramana's teaching or through Jesus or through another way, it might have a different, in Ramana's teaching, he calls it self-inquiry and abiding as the self. In another teaching, it might be called something else. It doesn't matter. But you have to go through that same process. You know, it's like if you want to learn to play tennis, there's only one essential way you can do it. You've got to get on the tennis court and pick up a tennis racket and hit the ball. That's the only way you can learn to play tennis. You can read as many books as you want. You can learn to play hockey. Maybe playing hockey will improve your tennis skills. You know, you can learn to play table tennis. Maybe that will improve your tennis skills. You know, you can read books about tennis. Maybe that will help as well. So lots of things that can help. But the only way you can really do it is by stepping on the tennis court, picking up a racket and playing. Do you get it? In the same way, the only way you can end ignorance is by abiding as a self. You don't have to come through me or Ramana, but you have to abide as the self in some way. When you abide as the self, you realize why this is true as well. You realize why all the other ways don't work. And this again is pointed out in the path of Sri Ramana. But when you abide as a self, and I'll explain to you what that means in a second, Sarah, don't you worry. When you abide as a self, then you start to realize firsthand, oh yes, this is not a cult. This is a very deep beneficial practice. And it works in a completely different way to every other practice. Okay. What is it to abide as a self? The first is a conceptual framework. The conceptual framework is this: I am the subject and I am aware of objects. What is conceptual framework? It's I am the subject and I'm aware of objects. We've got to take that on faith or accept that. Most of us, that's pretty easy to accept. Some people, they find that difficult. You've got to look at it from that point of view. You've got to accept that this kind of reasoning for these teachings to work. If you don't accept that, teachings won't work for you, or they're less likely to work for you. And this is the path of knowledge. So what am I? I am that subject consciousness. I'm aware of a variety of objects. We can categorize these objects in different ways. But the simplest way I find, body, mind, and world. I'm aware of the body. I'm aware of the mind. I'm aware of the world. And I'm aware of all those other things that we can call the mind, like thoughts, feelings, imaginations, these sorts of things. States of consciousness. This will all be considered the mind, subtle objects. What I am is none of these things because I am aware of them. I am that which is aware of them. Okay, this is the traditional reasoning. So what I am is that pure subject consciousness that is aware of all these objects. All these objects are not me. They're Atman. And what I am is the self, Atman. Atman means the self. Atman is the Sanskrit word for the self. To abide as a self, what you have to do, you have to be what you are. You've got to be the subject. You've got to take all objects to be unreal, illusory, and not you. More than that, you take your attention away from objects and you turn your attention to the subject. Ramana gives us a very potent, powerful question we can ask ourselves. He says the question, who am I? Who am I? But he gives us a two-pronged approach we can use. Very useful to orientate ourselves in the self-inquiry. Self-inquiry and abiding as a self is the same thing. You can think of it slightly differently. You can think of self-inquiry as the process which leads to abiding as the self, or you can think of them both as being the same thing. But what we're essentially doing is we're placing our attention onto the subject consciousness, away from objects. And Ramana gives us two questions we can use, which he explains to us in Who Am I? In this book, Who Am I? So if you've got some thoughts coming up or you're seeing something, you can say, to whom do these thoughts appear? Yeah? You're smiling, Sarah. You know this one? To whom do these thoughts appear? And then you say, to me. Now that's the first question. That sets up this paradigm that I've just explained, this conceptual framework, this subject-object conceptual framework, which is I am the subject aware of objects. So whatever object appears, you say, to whom does this object appear? If you're thinking, you can say, to whom do these thoughts appear? And the answer is to me. These thoughts are the objects, I am the subject. That first question is setting up this subject-object paradigm. And you're saying that I am the subject, aware of the objects. If you're really scared, if you're feeling a negative emotion, you can say, to whom does this negative emotion arise? You say, to me. You are that pure consciousness. You're not the body-mind. You're the pure consciousness that's aware of body, mind, and world, thoughts, feelings, emotions. And then the second question, the first question is, to whom does it appear? To me is the answer. And the second question is, who am I? And what that question is meant to do is to take our attention away from objects, and you're meant to look at yourself. Now this can be very, very confusing for people, because ordinarily everything you look at or observe is an object. By definition, if you're looking at something, it is by definition an object. Correct? We've defined objects as anything that you perceive. Anything that arises in your consciousness is an object. So what you are is not an object. That's the conceptual framework we're using. You're the subject. So this can be very confusing to people when they say, become aware of the subject. When you do the practice, at first it's very difficult because your attention is always habitually used to going outwards to objects. But if you follow the instructions and you try and become aware of what you are, the subject, you will find that even though logically it might not make sense, how can I be aware of a subject? Because you can't, in a way. You'll find that actually you can in a strange way. You'll find that when you turn the mind towards a subject, the mind disappears because the mind is an illusion. The mind is the ignorance. And all that remains is pure consciousness. That's the self. That's your true nature. It's the consciousness, it's the Sat, Chit, Ananda, devoid of objects. There's no even happiness there. Happiness itself is an object. It's a subtle object. The Ananda, in Sat, Chit, Ananda, is the lack of suffering. It's not an object. It's not an object called happiness. Ananda means happiness. So through doing this practice, you end up abiding as the pure consciousness that you are. And when you do that and you realize that is what you are, this is when the teachings come alive. This is when you realize this whole other world is an illusion. You start to realize. Maybe you realize it straight away. Maybe it will be over time. And then when you finish your practice and your attention comes back out to the world again, you'll see everything as an illusion. But then slowly ignorance will come back again. And as ignorance comes back, you'll take yourself to be this body-mind entity. You'll feel this illusion come back. And then you'll take this world to be a real external world. But when you do self-inquiry, it removes the egotism. It removes ignorance. It removes this belief in I'm the body-mind. And so when you come back to the world, for a while you will realize it's all just an illusion. But then the ignorance will seep back in again. So you've got to keep on coming back to the self. And this is abiding as the self. What you are, the pure consciousness, is self-aware of itself. It's aware of itself, but it's not aware of itself as an object. Normally, everything we're aware of is as an object. So if I'm aware of my hand, it's because I can see it, it's an object. Tom, the subject, what in ignorance you think is a subject, is aware of the hand, the object. But when your self-realization or self-awareness, self-abidance, self-knowledge is a peculiar, unique type of knowledge or experience in that there's no object present. Yet there is a kind of, in quotes, knowledge or experience. It's just pure subjectivity, being pure subjectivity. There's no duality, there's no knower, known, there's no subject object, just pure subjectivity, being itself. And in that there's a peculiar kind of self, it's not a void. This is the Sat. It's something that is. It's indescribable. Can't put it into words. Ooh, has someone just left the call? I think they have. Okay. Let's see. What did they write? Okay. Yeah. So it's just abiding as what you are, your true self. That is what it is to abide as the self. That is one essential teaching. And everything else is to help facilitate that.